Glad you're back for week 3 of our study, Jesus Speaks. And this journey we're taking to the 7 churches of Revelation. And I hope in the first couple weeks along with us that you have learned to grow in your love for Jesus Christ. And as a result, the stuff of life becomes less and less fearful to you. Today, we're in the city. We're located here because we're going to go to another city, the city of Pergamum, where Jesus simply speaks to that church there, live holy. Are you willing to stand out in a crowd? Not too long ago, I was selected for jury duty. And as I made my way to the room where we were all supposed to wait for instructions and the fact that we might be potential jurors for a case, a lady came in and she began to swear us all in. You know the one where you raise your right hand and you swear that you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. And I was surprised because in my mind I was thinking no one's going to stand up and make a scene here in the middle of everybody. But this older gentleman raised his hand and said, yeah, I have an objection. And so she, in front of all those people, administered a separate promise that he had to make and an oath that he had to take. Here's the deal. It's not about the oaths. What really impressed me on that day is that this man was willing to be different than everybody else in the room. And that it occurs to me that sometimes, even when you're older in life, the peer pressure, the cultural pressure causes you to want to fit in and to blend in. This man didn't. Today we're going to go to Pergamum and we're going to learn what that means to stand out from the crowd. But first, JK is going to tell us a little bit about that city.
Pergamum means citadel. It paints a picture of a fortress on high ground. So Pergamum is appropriately named because it's built on a 1,000-foot acropolis. Mike and I in our partnership and travels around the world have been to places like Israel, Greece, and Turkey, and we've observed that there are a number of cities that are built on unbeatable, seemingly unbeatable locations. That was Pergamum. It thrived, 300,000 plus population, a renowned library, a 10,000-seat stadium, a healing center that would have paralleled our modern day Mayo Clinic. But Jesus says He's got 2 distinct things against them. One, located in Revelation 2, verse 14, he describes as the teachings of Balaam, probably a reference back to Numbers 25 and Balaam being hired by King Balak of Moab to seduce Israel into sexual sin. The second, in Revelation 2, verse 15, has something to do with the teachings of the Nicolaitans. We don't know all the specifics of that. What we do know is that these 2 teachings infiltrated this church, this citadel-like church. A drifting had occurred. And Jesus says he's going to war against her. So it raises a deeply personal question. Have I said anything, heard anything, seen anything, done anything that dishonors Jesus? Let's listen to Mike's teaching, Live Holy.
Well, let's get to this ancient letter that the Apostle John wrote to the church in Pergamum through Jesus. And it starts off with a very serious note because right from the very beginning, Jesus says, these are the words of him who has the sword in his mouth. And so this warfare connotation from the very beginning, and that leads immediately then to him knowing exactly where they live. I want you to see that in verse 13. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. So in other words, he's saying, I understand that you guys that live in Pergamum, there's a satanic force, there's a battle going on there spiritually. A lot of people wonder what this Satan's throne is all about. Some people conjecture that because they were kind of guardians of the Roman emperor cult of worship, that's maybe what the reference was. I've actually been there and seen an altar that's kind of to the side of the city itself, a platform that held the altar to Zeus, the great ancient god of the Greeks. Maybe that is the throne of Satan. Maybe it's a reference to the Asclepion, which JK mentioned a little earlier, the place of healing where people could go. Actually, the symbol of Asclepius, the god of healing, is a snake. So maybe that serpent, Satan kind of configuration is what Jesus is talking about there. At any rate, he's talking about a war that's going on. In fact, the war is so bad that a guy by the name of Antipas, he's the only guy we know from this city of Pergamum, was actually killed for his faith. Legend has it that in 92 AD, he was burned alive in a brazen bull. So the war is real. Jesus is coming with a sword. Satan has got his throne in Pergamum. There's a spiritual battle going on. And that's where Jesus comes to the compromise of this church. In verse 14, he says, I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel. Now, we don't have time to go into detail about this, but if you go and look at Numbers 22 through 24, you'll find that as Israel was getting ready to move into the Promised Land, Balak, the king of Moab, was afraid. And so he tried to really get one of the prophets of God to prophesy against the children of Israel. 3 times he tried this, tried to pay him off to get him to curse Israel. In fact, what he ended up doing was blessing Israel over and over again. Balak was very upset. We don't know exactly what happened there, but Balaam becomes a symbol for Israel throughout its history, all the way into the writings of Peter in the New Testament, as someone who leads the people of God astray. When we get to Numbers 35, what we find is because the Israelites and the Moabites had gotten close enough that they had begun mingling in marriages and dating and parties and worshiping false gods. And so when you come to this teaching, it has to do something with fornication, something sexual is going on. I just want to make this really quick point here, because I think this is important for us to understand today. Sometimes Satan can't curse us, and here's what I think: if Satan can't curse us, he'll entice us. I believe the sin of Balaam was that he got so close and friendly with the Moabites that the other Israelites did as well, and before you know it, they were enticed to start practicing the sin of the Moabite people. And so today we want to talk about living holy. How do we separate ourselves? If you live in a place where Satan dwells, how is it that you separate yourself from that kind of spiritual warfare? And I'd like to go to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. He starts off with the Beatitudes, but then he gets into some serious teaching. And you know, sometimes as Christians we believe that because of the grace of Jesus Christ, we can just kind of live as loose as we want to. But in fact, it's under the grace of Jesus Christ that causes us to want to live more holy as Christ creates us in Him. In fact, Paul asked this question in Romans 6:1, should we go on sinning more so that grace may increase? And he says, may it never be. We're called as Christians to stand out from the rest of the culture around us. And so Jesus gives us in Matthew 5 some really simple lessons, just 5 of them that I want to point out for you today, for you to consider with your small group. He says, I want you to have holy living with your emotions. I want you emotionally to stand out from the crowd. You've heard it said that you shouldn't murder somebody, but I'm saying don't hate them, don't get angry with them, don't lash out at them. Maybe you should today think about how you live holy with your emotions and your anger and the way you control that. He goes on to say, live holy with your sexuality. He says, listen, it's said in the Old Testament, don't commit adultery, but I'm telling you, if you look lustfully on a woman, you've committed adultery already in your heart. Jesus is going for all the things that bombard us, the temptations that entice us, that draw us in. In fact, that's the word that's used here in verse 14 with this church from Pergamum. The word porneia is the word for sexual fornication, and it has to do with lusting for more and more and more. And we certainly live in a culture where Satan battles for us through the visuals of sexuality and pornography and temptations all around. Jesus also challenged us to live holy in our marriages. Apparently in the first century, it was easy to get a divorce and to break the covenant that one had made with their spouse before God. But Jesus says, no, hold that as holy. And so maybe we should be different with our marriages, and He's calling us to that. Holy living in our speech. How do you talk? Do you sound like the rest of the world? Or do you tell the same jokes? Do you use the same words, the same kind of expressions? Are you mean-spirited with your words? Does your speech stick out as holy? Does it stand out in the crowd of the world? And then finally, holy living towards those who hurt us. You know, one of the greatest ways for us to stand out as holy people of God is to love those who hate us, to pray for those who hate us, to serve those who want to do evil to us. So we got this idea that what God is calling us to and what Jesus is calling His church to in this book of Revelation, this letter to the church at Pergamum, is to stand out, to live holy. Don't mix and mingle with all the stuff that's going on in Pergamum. In Pergamum, they were drawn into temple worship and offering to false gods and festivals and feasts that would celebrate false gods, and that would often be accompanied with sexuality and orgies and stuff that's just unbelievable to mention even. But the Christians were actually being drawn into this instead of standing out. He's saying to this church in Pergamum, and I think He's saying to us, hey, let's be different from the world. Let's live holy. And of course, then that brings us to the finish line. We've talked about that word all the way through the study, nikao, to conquer, to overcome, to win the victory. And Jesus says, you know what, at the victory, I'm going to give you a couple things here. Let's look at that together. I'll give you the hidden manna and the white stone with a new name written on it. And I actually have a white stone here today, and there's several possibilities for what that white stone may have been about when Jesus mentions it to those who overcome. The white stone could have been a judgmental, that you're acquitted, you're not guilty. Maybe that's what Jesus was alluding to. It might have had something to do with the Asclepion and your permission to go into the healing waters or to see the doctors of the day, to be healed with all their incantations and their charms. Finally, this stone was obviously used for people to be invited into some of the parties and the celebrations that were in honors of other gods. It's said that sometimes they were actually worn as amulets around the neck or the wrist to let people in. This was your entrance into the party. This was your entrance into the healing. This was your acquittal from all guilt. Jesus comes with a sword in his mouth, and he says to this church, he says to us, if you don't repent, I'm at war with you. But I don't want to be at war with you. I've already won the battle through Jesus Christ. And so if you will overcome, live like overcomers, separated from the world, then I will give you on that day of judgment the white stone. You're acquitted, you're healed, and you get to live with me forever.